This video is a bit different. Today, I'm going to be talking about an API tool called Apidog. In real-world scenarios, working with a dev team, one way or another, you might run into APIs and you'll end up using tools that help you manage and test APIs with your team. And Postman is the most common one. But Apidog is an all-rounded tool, I think, and it does its job really well. And because these tools are actually used in real world, it can help you quite a lot in my experience. For example, to understanding API endpoints or maybe even API designing, not in terms of like a deep level of understanding, but at least get a good picture of what you and your team are probably going to be working with. You can download this for either Windows, Mac, or Linux. So Apidog seems to be focusing more on the collaborative side of things, like more of like an all-in-one app, which isn't good at one thing and bad at another. Everything actually works together really well. Things like auto-generate request params and body, or auto-validate API responses, Postman scripts compatibility is supported, unlimited collection tests, which if you are using Postman, you already know this is huge. If you are using Postman and you're interested in how Apidog compares with Postman, you can go ahead to their website and check the differences. There is so much to talk about that I probably cannot cover everything in this video. But anyways, you guys can go ahead and read it out and see for yourself. For me personally, I do think that it looks a lot better, first of all. Because I used to sit and use Postman for a very long time in a single day. And yeah, this actually looks way better to use as well. And the UI and everything about it. Don't even get started on the features that are just way too much to even, like, I don't even use all of them, you know? Yeah, it covers pretty much everything. You can sort of just create that API documentation right in the app itself and just open it straight up in the browser. You can also run mock servers and test cases and much more. Okay, so let's take a look at migrating a little bit here. So for example, if you are using Postman and you want to sort of just migrate a collection, then what you want to do, right, is just export the collection from Postman first and also export the environment as well. And back in Apidog, let's just create a new project, right, and just name it the same thing. To do API, just create that. Once you've done that, you can now just import those JSON files that you have just exported from Postman into here. So we can just go to import, and then you can see the amount of options you have here. So if you're using something else, and you probably see it has support for Apidog, Markdown, Google Discovery, Insomnia, whatever it is that you want to use, right? I'm going to go with Postman, and we're just going to choose the JSON files that we have here, and just go ahead and open it up. Press OK, and you should see here that we pretty much have everything, like our endpoints are actually being imported here. And there's also something that I want to talk about, which is the branch. And currently we have only one branch, which is the main branch. And if we compare this to our Postman, you'll see that we have new request, register user, login, whatever. It's the same thing here. So just like that, it's all imported into here. And then we're just going to go ahead and confirm this, and we can actually test this out and see if this actually works. There you go, import successful, 7 endpoints and 1 environment. Yes, because we imported an environment called testing. Go in here, go to our APIs, and you can see that we have everything here now. And what I want to do now is that our endpoints is actually just our endpoints. So what is our base default URL? It should be the local 8000 like we kind of have here. That should just be our default. So now if we just quickly select an environment, our environment has also been successfully imported. And we can check our environment and testing, and we can see that we have the default server here. So what we pretty much want to do, right, is the localhost 8000, right? That is our base URL. Another thing you'll notice is that the variables that you have in your previous environment, like for example in Postman, you'd probably have like some other variables down here as well, but this is just a random environment, so there's basically nothing. So whatever variables you have in your environment will be imported into here as well. Save that, and we're good. We should now have our base URL here, and these would just be our endpoints. And if you actually try to run the server right now, you should see that it's actually working. Obviously, this is just a basic API example, so this is not like a real world API, because of course, I can't show that because of the tokens and everything inside of it. Okay, so that was migrations. So now if you actually try to create a endpoint and like a folder of an endpoint in here, let's see how that looks like. Coming up to the plus sign and going to the new endpoint folder. And we're just going to name this fake coffee API, I guess. because we're going to be using a fake API to check this out. And then we're just going to add an endpoint really quickly. For example, if we just go ahead and grab this random API right here, this should just give us the random coffee data. And yeah, there it is. ID1, ID2. Okay, so it seems to be just working as expected. So you can go ahead and check the cookies and headers, just similar to Postman, right? And we have an actual request section as well. And in the actual request section, if you actually come all the way down, they actually have a client-side code as well. So for shell, you have things like curl, HTTP. For JavaScript, you also have things like Axios, jQuery, a lot of languages here. Like you have Go as well, so that's actually really nice. Java as well. Yeah, so this is great actually. You can view this in a lot of options like raw, preview, visualize, but I'm just going to stick with pretty. And you also have formats like JSON, XML, HTML, text, or auto format. And then we also have like the encoding options. Now let's go back to the endpoints that we migrated from Postman. So if we go to the register user, and then you can see that we have the username and password. This is just going to be a very quick example on how you might actually go about doing things. But yeah, so how this basically works is to log in, you obviously need to register first. Sometimes you just want these values to be dynamic. And it doesn't have to be a username and password. It can be anything. I'll just show you in a bit here. So what you can actually do, right, instead of having it fixed as this email and this random password, you can have it dynamically change every time you send a request. So you can come in here and do an insert dynamic value and then go to the data generator. Okay, so let's do an example email, I guess. We're just going to press insert and there it is. For password, we can do the same thing and insert. And now if we try to just send this request, you should see that we get a random token here generated from our backend, which is how we want. And if we go see the actual request, we should see that this is actually the email that is being registered and the password that is randomly generated every time we send this request. So for example, if I go ahead and send it again, you'll see that it changes. So the value are basically changing dynamically. And the other thing you could do as well is, for example, if we go to the data schema section, we should see that it automatically has this username and password just added into here. You can sort of just go into username, select the format. So for example, ours is email. And of course, for password, we can do, I don't know, a password, yes. And there you go. Now for mock data, we can also choose what sort of email do you want to generate. So again, we'll just do email. Actually, let's just do example email here so that it's the same as the other one. There you go. And then the password. What we can also do is if we go back to the values, right? And for example, if we don't have this right here, but we have the data schema right here, like we can always add a new data schema by doing it, add a child node like that, and then just, you know, the stuff that you would actually want, and just go in here and set the format and everything about it. You can sort of see that it's not just the format, right? We have things like nullable, or if it's supposed to be a const, then maybe like a 1, and then that should just be always a 1. Before saving, you could kind of just preview this as well and see what sort of data is it generating. So if we go and dynamic generate, you should see that this is the example of what we're going to get. Once we're okay with that, we can just go ahead and leave this and save it. So that's how you'd go about setting up a data schema. So with that set up now, and you have saved it, you can go back to the value, and then you can see here that you can generate automatically. This will just automatically generate a JSON data with an email and everything. So you do not have to actually go down here and always check in the actual request. So you can kind of just generate it here every single time before you even start running the request. So like that, we can just generate this and then send a request again, and everything should still be fine, and you should see that it's the same one. And then we get the token response. So that's generally how you would go about doing this. And you could think about things that you could do with this. This is just an example. So this is just very simple with just some like username and password. But for example, if you have some really complicated data that always needs some sort of dynamic value, then you can sort of just create all dynamic values for this. This is really handy. So you don't have to sit here and think of a username or a password to test every single time. For example, if we just go ahead and generate this data and then send this request, So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this token right here and we're going to log in this user. So if we go to the login section, so now what we're first going to do is go to the header section, go ahead and select authorization and just paste that token in here. Now we can go back to the body, and now here we need those values as well. So if we go to the register user and we use the exact same thing here that we registered, this should technically now work. And if we send that, you should see that the request is 200, so that is perfectly fine. And then we get another token here, so that's okay. So the login is successful. Now, if we try to fetch to-dos and we go to the headers again, we have the authorization section as well. You can add a new param if you want. There is a lot of things you can choose from here. For example, I'm just going to do this maybe application JSON. Now, if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that we actually get the to-do list right here. Now you might notice something when we're actually fetching to-dos. We might actually get something like validate response result, and it says response data differs from endpoint spec. We can turn this off if we want to and then send it again, and it should just be gone. But the only reason this is showing up because we haven't actually set like a response state to let it know what kind of response we're going to get back. So if we actually go to response tab here, we'll see that we have this data schema right here, and we can sort of just set the response so that we know what kind of response we are receiving, and that just like double checks it as well. So I can just do this by generate from JSON right here. But before that, if we take a look at our response that we're getting, it's an array of objects, right? So that's what we would want to do. So in our response, we would generate JSON, and then here it is. This is not what we want, right? We need an object around it. Sorry, we need an array around it, right? So now it's an array of ID, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we select that and save that. And now if we try to run the response again, this should now validate the check for us as well that the response we're getting is the right one. It automatically adds the type as well, and you can change this if you want. What if you want to import your data from your database, right? You can go here and then choose up here, import from database, and then you can see the available options here. You can do it via DDL or just the normal database connections. So you would go here and go to manage database connection and select new. Now you'll be able to choose the database type such as the SQL, Oracle, or DB2, or maybe even Postgres if you're using Postgres. They do have MongoDB and Redis as well. You have the default options, Spinnerel or SSH, and you can also choose the default environment. And let's take a look at this one as well. So in create to-dos, we can also sort of just like create some dynamic random tasks just to test out our endpoints. And we're just going to go ahead and send this. We get the new task back as a random text in here. And taking a look at our actual request, we should also see the random text being generated down here, which is basically this. So that's working perfectly fine. And if we just try to fetch this again, you should see that we now have two tasks, which is exactly what we wanted. If we want to delete, right? So for example, I can actually just delete something with an ID. So if we have an ID of 8 and I kind of just want to delete this one, right? So we're just going to target it using its ID. So I'm just going to come in here and type in the ID like this. And you should see that it automatically generated this new path params. So now you can enter the value here. So for example, the ID was 8. So we can go ahead and change this to I guess it's an integer. And then we can try this out. So send this. And there you go. The to-do has been deleted. Response 200. So that's fine. And for the request, they do have a lot of options here. So depending on what you want to do, you would just choose that one. You've got the authorization specific page. If you want to add a JWT token, you can do that here, or maybe an OAuth 2.0, you can. We also have the pre-processors and post-processors. So in Postman, you would have to write like a custom script for this. But here you can just pretty much configure the script easily. So if you come into the post-processor, and for example, we have assertion in there, and then we also have the public scripts, which basically just brings in the scripts that you already have, or just make a custom script right from in here with the pre-built Postman syntaxes. So for example, we can just click on one of these. It just puts on that code onto the screen, which is very handy and very convenient. And then we also have the extract variables into the environment. and also other databases action like importing databases from such as MySQL, MongoDB, or Redis. On the bottom left under the response, you'll also see that there are actually two modes, which is the debug and the design mode. And the one that I'm currently on is the debug mode, which is the mode preferred if you already have a code written. But for the design mode, it is more like an API design first in mind, which is what Apidog really shines at as well. Apidog also has something called the smart mock, and this is really awesome, by the way. Imagine developing on the client side or like the front end and still waiting on the back end to develop this API so that we can start testing something. But then usually what we would do is have some sort of like a dummy data, but in this case it won't be called a dummy data. It's basically like a mock data, which is also generated right from in here, in this like basically in Apidog with that database that you have set. So there are three options for the mock URL, which is the local, the cloud, and self-hosted. The one I'm using is cloud. So what you need to do first is make sure that the cloud settings for the mock URL are turned on. So just go to the settings and go to the feature settings and go to the mock settings and navigate all the way down and make sure that the default mock type is set to smart mock, and then also make sure that it is set to open or basically public access, not private, so that you can have that running. If we come in here and then make sure that the cloud option is also turned on, and then when we hit the request button, you should see that it actually generated a response with all those random data that we added. So how do we actually create a mock URL? So to do that, we can just navigate to the new expectation tab and create the mock URL by first giving it a name and then a params condition if you want to, and then lastly the response data which you can generate. So I actually have one created right now, so let me just go into there and you can see that we actually have the expectation name up there, and the data is the data which is going to be dynamically inserted. The only thing I wish they added here was an option to insert the dynamic data right from in here like we had in the response tab, because I don't see it in here. So what I had to do was go out of this tab and then go to the response tab just to get the dynamic data, and then come back in here and paste it in here. But anyways, back to our mock data. So if we actually go in here and check, we actually have all the dynamic values inserted. What I meant was that if you reload the web page, the value is going to keep changing. So once you add that, make sure you save it, and then when you open the link in your browser, you should see this thing show up. So this is like a JSON data in here, and every time you reload, you can actually see the dynamic values working. So this is really great. I really like this. Now going back to the response tab, when you actually come into the data schema and you can see the mock section, which I haven't talked about yet, this is where you actually enter the dynamic values. So you can go in here and select what kind of dynamic values you want to add into your like your data. So for example, right here I have like a int, right? And then I have a minimum value of 0 and then a maximum of 30. So it will only random around the number of 0 and 30. And then for text, we also have things like some random text just to act like some sort of task, just like I did with the username and password. If you prefer to write a custom mock script, you can do that in here as well. For the design tab, there is not much difference in terms of the mock section. Schemas and component template. This is basically just a template for your data. Like I had one here for to do, which had to be used multiple times. If we drop down this, we can see that we basically have the same format here. So this is just like a reference to this schema, and you can add the mock data and whatever types you want to add into here. So instead of having to use this over and over again, like writing all these 4 lines, I can just use that one schema template to just refer to this data. Same as for the components, the default one here are the record not found 404 and the invalid input 400, but you can create more on your own, of course. On the left, you might notice something called test as well, and this is where you can actually run your test cases from within here itself. So if we just choose a new test scenario and just give it a name such as the to-do API test, and yeah, the folder root and priority P2, that's fine, continue. Now we can actually see that we have this nice test menu right here, and then we can add a step. You should see that we have a bunch of options here, such as the import from endpoint spec, import from endpoint case. We can add some sort of loops and everything else as well, but I'm just going to do from the endpoint spec, and we're going to choose the to-do API. So that's the folder that we want. We have all our endpoints in here now. So now what we can do is just go ahead and run this, and see how it goes. And then you can see that some of them has failed and some of them has passed. So this is a really great way to test your endpoints, and you can navigate between the passed ones and the failed ones. You can also change your testing environment. So for example, if we just change the testing to the cloud mock and run this again, and you should see that some passed, some failed, and somehow this has passed more than failed. So I don't know what's going on there, but anyways. You could also go straight and check in here why it failed, and it'll tell you the validated response result. You can check things like test reports to see how many times you've run the test, how many times it passed, how many times it failed. And you can also do the CI/CD pipeline operations. So for example, you would want to run this command in your terminal and add the Apidog access token, which you can just get from in here. So you have different options here like Azure pipelines or GitHub Actions and maybe even Jenkins and GitLabs. Another thing I almost forgot to talk about is the branches. Postman has its own Git integrations. This doesn't, but it works just like that. But it also means that you could be working on a feature API without having to affect anything with the main branch. And does this also mean you can run mock services per branch? Yes, I would think so. I don't think you can do that with Postman though. So let's just create one really quickly here. So I'm just going to call it maybe 1.0.1. Yeah, you can choose to fork from the current API version or just fork a totally blank one. And save that and unsave changes, that's fine. And now you should see that we're actually in the API feature 1.0.1. If you look from the collaboration side of things, this might be better with the built-in testing and documentation, which is the last thing we're going to be talking about. So if you go to the shared docs and select on new, you can actually create a new documentation by giving it a title and then choosing the environment. For example, I'm just going to choose Cloud Mock. And then you can choose if you want to have a password, so only people with the password can see this documentation. Or you can also choose the endpoints and the API versioning. So for example, if I just select the to-do API, all the endpoints, and then if you go ahead and save this, so it just creates this website for us. So when we open it up, we should see this nice documentation for all our endpoints. So you can see, like for the first one, we have the get request, and we can also generate a code right here, and you'll see that it allows us to generate a schema code in TypeScript, and also TypeScript Zod as well. That is very interesting. So Postgres and SQLite as well. We can also try to run this in here directly. So if we just paste in the authorization code that we need and then just send this, it should just work. Yeah. So you can actually just run it straight from in here as well. So everyone who has the documentation can just check everything inside of here. And if you have doubts on how to use Apidog, then you can head to their documentation page and it should have everything you could possibly want. It's going to be your best friend in learning how to use Apidog because it does have a little bit of a learning curve to it. But yeah, it's not too hard or anything. As long as you understand how API and back-end, front-end works, you're going to be just fine. And they do have a plan for a enterprise version, or if you want just to use a free version, that's fine. Yeah, definitely check them out. And yeah, thank you guys for watching and sticking to the end. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.